All right, how's it going, y'all? So I'm really happy because TrueNAS Scale has released, it was a while ago and I've been testing it for a while, Scale 23.10 Cobia. I'm not saying that right, but it is that update. And it is a great update. It's not an update that's overhauling and bringing brand new features and all that huge stuff like we saw with the first few releases of TrueNAS Scale, especially the first release of TrueNAS Scale. But this release is phenomenal because it is just a very great update that cleans up a lot of stuff and makes some stuff a lot faster. And I've seen genuine speed improvements, not just from stuff when you actually test and get numbers, but genuinely just using the system from an SMB's perspective has had massive performance increases on the order of about 20 to 25% in my case with macOS, without doing anything at all, just updating, and it is so much more stable and useful, and it is just so much snappier. Especially for my workflow, which is Final Cut Pro, video editing off of it, I have noticed way snappier response times, and my export times have even gone down. So we're getting way better random reads for sure, and then just sequential reads are also doing really well, as far as I can tell, on the order of about 20 to 25%. Without doing any major overhauls, which is a great thing to see. So while TrueNAS is a very old operating system that's had a ton of history, TrueNAS Scale, the Linux version of TrueNAS, is quite new. It is about 2 or 3 years old, depending on when you say it was actually developed and actually came out as a full release. And so it is a pretty new operating system. So what they're doing is they're essentially breaking up the development cycle into kind of 2 different sections. New features that will be sent over to a brand new operating system that all rolls out together. In this case, it was 23.10, so they're using year releases as almost a complete project. And then for things with the current project that you're on, you get bug fixes and things like that, but you don't get massive changes to everything. So Scale 23.10 was the very first release of the 23 version of TrueNAS Scale, and it brought in a ton of features and performance improvements that people have been waiting on. And I think it went very well. I successfully updated 3 weeks ago, maybe, right? I actually updated to the beta to see the SMB improvements, and the beta was even stable. And since then, every update I've had to it has been very rock solid steady. So before I dive into the release notes and talk about some of the great new features like dRAID, I do want to mention that this is one of the updates that has feature flag update options. So essentially zpools, your ZFS arrays, have their own feature flags associated with them, and if you upgrade them, you cannot bring them into an older version of TrueNAS. So one really great thing about TrueNAS is you can easily roll back your OS in 2 seconds as long as you do not upgrade your zpool. So what I would recommend doing for everybody who's testing this out is first update, then do not update your zpools yet. Instead, just use it for a week or 2 and make sure that there's no glaring issues or anything like that. I found it to be very stable, but you never know. And then after you found it to be stable for a week or so, then you can go in and under the pool manager, hit update your zpools, and that way you'll get some of the new feature flags. Most of them are not critical, but there are a couple that are very nice, such as the ability for SMB block cloning and NFS block cloning, which is basically fast clone on Synology. Really great feature I'll talk about in a minute here. So I just wanted to mention that for people who are looking to update, you can roll back as long as you've not upgraded your ZFS arrays. All right, so now with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about some of the big updates and the release notes to this. And we do need to touch on some of the features that have been completely removed. They were deprecated in previous versions and they had been saying they were going to be removed. And technically they did it in the last update, but really they did it for Scale 23.10. So we do need to touch on that as well. And a lot of these, if you look at them, they're very much cleaning up the UI. And I guess the easiest way to describe it is the cohesion of the whole system. Make it much more user-friendly and having a lot easier and quicker way of accessing things. Anybody who used Scale in the past knows that like when you're deploying virtual machines or especially apps, sometimes just stuff does not load in and other things like that. And so they kind of overhauled that underneath. And so you'll see a lot of these features are kind of in that vein of just making it more user-friendly and less buggy to say. So they cleaned up the storage pool creation as well as the apps. And one of the big things is they now use net data as the backend. And this gets you way more granular results than you ever had in the past. So now if you go into the reporting tab, by the way, the first time when you update, this is going to be really slow and it's not broken. You may think it's broken, but it's not broken. It's basically just doing an upgrade on all your data. But you'll see we have way more granular results than we ever had in the past. Maybe it just looks like that, who even knows? But you can see these spikes a lot tighter, and you kind of get a lot more data. I almost don't like it because of that. I feel like the old version of Scale kind of had a little bit more curves to it, and you could see averages more. It kind of depends what's more useful. For me, a lot of time, I kind of like to see trends, and I think you lose the trends here a little bit. But either way, it is updated, and it is much, much snappier. But this is one screen that I don't necessarily like as much because I don't think this really tells me very much information at all. Whereas the old kind of average out things you had in previous versions of TrueNAS and TrueNAS Core kind of did tell you more because it was just looking at the average. Maybe it's just the way I'm used to looking at it, but it's kind of hard to tell what's going on from these very, very deep spikes. But that is using net data in the back end. One thing I do wish they would add, and they still have not added from TrueNAS Core, is the ability to see overall utilization of a single disk. All they give us is I/O and temperature, but I think in performance debugging, especially when you're trying to figure out, is a disk dying, or what is my limitation? Is it the Z pool? Is it actually the disk IOPS? What is it? Is actually to have a metric for disk utilization. Basically, if that disk just cannot handle any more commands and that's the limiting factor, it's kind of hard to tell if that's just very difficult to add in on Linux. Synology has it for theirs. And I do find that as a place where I'm looking very often to figure out, am I limited by the Z pool? Am I limited by the hardware? Am I limited by Samba? Am I limited by NFS? Trying to debug those things. I do find that seeing one-off disk metrics is very useful. So that is the update to the reporting tab. It is now using, well, what is it? Net data. And so then the next big section is updates to SMB. And for me, my clientele, it's really small businesses using it as a file server, video editing server, all that kind of stuff. And SMB is a huge component of that, if not the key component of that. And the SMB speed improvements, Samba and SMB, essentially you can put them in the same thing. SMB is the protocol, Samba is the Linux implementation of it. It's just faster. And it now also directly supports multi-protocol with NFS, something I generally don't recommend doing just because stuff can still get weird, but now it does support it directly, which can help a lot. I'm not sure how well they're doing locking of files and things like that, but for certain workflows, it can be very important. So that was a huge update. One thing they did remove out of Samba, which I guess I get and I also don't like, is they've removed the ability to add auxiliary parameters within the system. So you used to be able to go into your services as well as your actual just SMB shares and be able to go into advanced settings and add auxiliary parameters right here, such as fruit, groups, all those kinds of things. And that has now been removed out. Now, I kind of go back and forth on this. I understand why they did it, especially with older versions of TrueNAS, talking back all the way to when it was FreeNAS. There are a lot of help articles online about modifying those parameters to get better performance. And I don't think it's something that's really necessary nearly as much today. And I think it's likely that that was actually causing a lot of performance issues on their end and a lot more bug reports and a lot of stuff like that because people are throwing these random parameters in there trying to debug it. I know I certainly did it. I didn't report it, but I was definitely trying those things to figure out how to get better performance when I would have performance hiccups. And a lot of times those performance hiccups were not necessarily even caused by or could be fixed by this, but rather just needing an actual OS update to fix those. But they have removed those out. Apparently anything you modified beforehand will now be locked in, and you can modify it from the command line or the API. I go back and forth on that. I understand why they did it, but I still would prefer having that capability to modify those because there are some things that are necessary to do it sometimes, and it can really help with debugging. And modifying parameters via the command line with TrueNAS is always a bit of a tough situation, trying to get it to actually hold on boot and things like that. And I think people are much more likely to break stuff than they would if they could just modify it from there. The next really great thing, well, one, there is pause and unpause for ZFS scrubs, which is great. Previously, you just had to kill the scrub. But another really great thing is finally ZFS block cloning, which is just something that is so nice to have. It is the ability to use the copy on write system of ZFS to essentially deduplicate blocks without having to run a deduplication script. Because if you are copying and pasting a file, duplicating that file, the system knows it's the exact same file. And so essentially what this is able to do is it just uses that to do an instant copy. And so it doesn't actually take up space on disk. So if you are on SMB and you copy and paste a 1 terabyte image, it will instant copy and it will only take up 1 terabyte of space, not 2. But there's no chance that these two blocks are now like linked or anything, that all of a sudden they're going to be the same file. You edit one of them, the other one edits. No, it doesn't work like that. ZFS does this all the time, and it's guaranteed that they're different. But any modification from then on would be additional space, but it's a really nice thing to have, and it can just speed up performance, especially when you're like restoring single off files from snapshots. It's really nice to be able to use that methodology because it's so much quicker, because you don't have to duplicate space because that space is already there, it's already used. And so this is probably where most file systems actually get the majority of duplication, is just having people copy and pasting files so that they can have their own version of it in their own folder. And so I think this is a very useful feature. I enable all the time on Synology. Synology's had this a while with BTRFS, but now it's coming here, and I think it's just really nice. That is one thing that does require the pool upgrade that I mentioned earlier, and so you will not get that feature until you upgrade the pool. The next really big thing, and probably the last big feature that's included in this, is dRAID. So dRAID is a very interesting thing. It is completely different than RAID Z1, 2, and 3, but kind of in the same vein. So it's very hard for me to explain how dRAID works. There is a great graph here, and I will leave a link down to a great video from OpenZFS community that went over exactly how it works. But essentially what dRAID is it is kind of like how RAID 4 and RAID 5 are different. So the difference between RAID 4 and RAID 5 is pretty simple. Basically in RAID 4, you have 5 drives. And then the 6th drive is the parity drive. And the way that works is all 5 of those drives that are the data drives only ever have data on them, and that 6th drive only ever has parity on it. And so you have one parity drive and it's completely separate. The problem with that is you can get some issues with performance and things like that. So when you've got RAID 5, you're actually striping it through. So on the first block, the first drive is parity. On the second block, the second drive is parity, and it goes down like that. And that has a lot of great performance improvements, and you're also not putting all your eggs in one basket. And so rebuild can be quicker, more efficient, and just less likely to be error prone. And so by doing that, you get a lot of really great performance improvements, because now you don't just have one disk that's basically just kind of useless and always being used for parity. Instead, it's striped all the way through. This is essentially what dRAID does, but now with hot spares. So now with dRAID, you can start combining a lot of storage groups, which I would call RAID Z1 groups, but now they're their own section. It's a completely different nomenclature. You can essentially do that same thing with your hot spares. So instead of having one drive as a hot spare, you kind of have your hot spares all striped through. So every single disk has a little bit of section space for hot spare data. So now, instead of having the performance limitation where you've got one drive that you have to rebuild, and so rebuild times basically are limited to the speed of any one drive, now rebuild times, resilvers, are the speed of the entire pool, because every single drive is participating in actually getting data on there, and they're all kind of a hot spare. Now, that is not a perfect explanation by any means, and one other thing that it does have is it's not got as storage efficiency as something like RAID Z1, due to the fact that dRAID still uses variable stripe widths, but they always fill an entire stripe. So if you're just writing a single bit, a single sector, you actually have to take up an entire line, an entire stripe, because they need that rebuild speed. They don't want to go in and have to remap the entirety of how wide every single stripe is. I am butchering this explanation. Really, there are experts out there, and I will leave a link down in the video below. I don't think this is something a lot of people are going to be implementing anytime soon, but it is something that's been added into OpenZFS for a long time now. And I do think for larger enterprises, dRAID can be very valuable because your rebuild times are way faster. So especially if you have a massive amount of disks that are continuously being accessed. That's probably the most important thing, is when you're continuously being accessed, RAID Z can take a very long time to rebuild. So that is a great time to use this. And I think in the next few years, it's going to be more and more common to see. I don't think on the consumer level, but really the enterprise level. So that is the dRAID, and I believe it is currently only through the command line still, but eventually it's probably going to come into the actual UI. Now the last piece I do want to mention is some of the deprecated services. Well, not deprecated, completely removed now. They were deprecated in old versions. For this release, it's actually technically in the last version 22.12.3, but really this version removed out all of these services from the ability. And some of them do not actually have a capability at all. One of the hardest ones for me was OpenVPN client, because there's not really a good OpenVPN client on Docker anymore either. So it's kind of tough for those kinds of things. There's not really any replacements. A lot of this stuff like LLDP, I don't see a lot of people using. Dynamic DNS, I mean, they really did just kind of remove out all the stuff to make your own VPN server. So now essentially they want you to use Docker and the packages to actually deploy these things, which does have its pros and cons. But a lot of this stuff, you really need to make sure you've got a replacement for it and you're ready to go if you are using this. So another one that I actually had to do a lot of replacement on is the rsync server, so rsync daemon. Basically, it was a different version of rsync that actually ran on its own service port, and it was unencrypted, and you can kind of list it out like shares, kind of like SMB in a lot of ways. That has been deprecated and removed out. So now they really want you to just use SSH, which is rsync with encryption, which is probably better. Though it does look like there is now a service. For a while there, I don't think there was a planned service. They were saying, hey, just get off of it. But now it looks like they've added an application. But there's a lot of these things here. I think what a lot of people will feel is WebDAV. It's unfortunate that now you can't have your permissions and your users use WebDAV natively. Instead, now you will have to go ahead and use the deployed application and some things like that. But they've gone through. If you're using any of these services, just make sure you know that these are being deprecated. They're technically being deprecated before Scale 23.10, but it's actually just for Scale 23.10. So it's in the last version of Bluefin has deprecated and removed these guys on out. So just a warning to people, I was able to get around it, but it is unfortunate. I think overall, they are really positioning themselves to not really try to compete with something like Synology. Instead, they're competing at a higher level with large enterprises who really just want the most secure system. And by removing out things like WebDAV from native integration, you can very easily become a lot more secure, because quite frankly, there's just less threat surface when you don't have something like WebDAV that is designed to be open to the internet available. Same thing with OpenVPN server and things like that. It's really kind of saying, hey, if you want to do that stuff, you can do it in Docker, but we're not going to add it into the direct operating system to kind of limit out exposure and also limit the chance that they get hacked. So that is a key component there. All right, well, that's pretty much it. Overall, I found this update to be really rock solid, steady, and secure, and I've had no issues with it. I've been using it since the beta, and it really came out and it had great performance improvements and no real issues whatsoever. I would not normally recommend running beta software, but for me, I try to test stuff ahead of time, and they've come out and everything's gone very well. You definitely want to check it out, because especially if you're using SMB, you will really notice true performance improvement that I have not seen in a really long time just by updating, which is a great thing to see. I really hope we just keep down this train. Quite frankly, I think overall TrueNAS Scale is the future of TrueNAS. I think that all the new features are going in there, and I think really in 5 years, the primary deployed TrueNAS is not going to be core, it is going to be Scale, even for the big enterprise clients, just because Linux has so much more capability and so much more expandability, and it really is getting harder and harder to support FreeBSD as more and more packages are leaving it from a hardware and a driver perspective. All right, well, that's going to be it. Go and leave your experiences down in the comments below, and have a good one. Bye.